Elise Walker had always loved the sky. There was something about the gentle hum of the engines, the rhythmic sway of the aircraft, and the endless expanse of clouds that felt like home. She had spent the last 10 years as a flight attendant, crisscrossing the globe, perfecting the art of hospitality while navigating turbulence both in the air and in life. But tonight, on Flight 329 from London to New York, something felt different. Wrong. It started with a whisper of unease, a nagging sensation at the back of her mind that she couldn't shake. She had learned to trust her instincts over the years. They had saved her from more than a few difficult situations. And right now her instincts were screaming. As she moved through the cabin, her trained eyes scanned the rows of passengers. Most were sleeping, their heads tilted at awkward angles, bathed in the dim glow of overhead reading lights. Some passengers tapped away on laptops, while others were lost in the world of in-flight entertainment. But then there was him. The man sat stiffly, his posture rigid as if he were bracing for something. His hoodie was pulled up, casting a shadow over his gaunt face. He hadn't touched his meal, hadn't flipped through the in-flight magazine, hadn't even glanced at the screen embedded in the seat back before him. Instead, his gaze remained locked on something far more unsettling. The emergency exit door. Elise frowned. It wasn't unusual for nervous flyers to eye the exits, but this wasn't nervous curiosity. It was calculated focus. A different kind of intensity. A sharp, unwavering stare that sent a chill racing down her spine. "Can I get you something, sir?" she asked, keeping her voice light, professional. The man didn't flinch. For a moment, she wasn't even sure he had heard her. Then, slowly, his head turned and his eyes met hers. Cold. Unreadable. Empty. "I'm fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elise hesitated. "Are you sure? Maybe some water, tea?" "No," the response was firm. Final. She forced a polite smile and moved down the aisle, but her mind was already racing. Something wasn't right. She had dealt with all kinds of passengers, anxious flyers, intoxicated travelers, even the occasional unruly troublemaker, but this was different. This was something else entirely. Then came the message. Half an hour later, as Elise stepped into the rear galley to refill a tray of water cups, a folded napkin caught her eye. It had been left on the counter, wedged between the coffee dispenser and the stack of unused plastic cups. She reached for it, her pulse quickening as she unfolded the crumpled paper. Scrawled in rushed, uneven handwriting were 3 words. "Oh, he knows." Elise's breath hitched. The ink was smudged in places as if whoever had written it had been shaking. The letters were bold, pressed into the napkin with such force that the paper had nearly torn. Who wrote this? And more importantly, who was he? She turned, scanning the galley. The other flight attendants were engaged in their tasks, refilling drinks, stacking snack trays, and preparing for the next round of service. None of them seemed to notice her hesitation, the way she clutched the napkin as if it held all the answers she needed. She needed to think. Quickly. Had a passenger written this? If so, why leave it in the galley instead of handing it to a crew member? Was someone in danger? Was she in danger? Her gaze flicked toward the aisle. 14B was empty. Her stomach dropped. The man in the hoodie was gone. Heart pounding, Elise moved toward the front of the plane. Passengers dozed in their seats, unaware of the unease unraveling in her mind. She scanned the rows carefully, looking for the missing man. Had he gone to the lavatory? Was he in first class? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound, a click, from behind her. She turned toward the galley and froze. One of the overhead compartments, the one reserved for crew equipment, was open. That compartment had been locked at takeoff. Only authorized personnel had access. And yet, now it hung slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peeking through. Elise took a cautious step forward, her breath shallow, her skin tingling with a foreboding she couldn't ignore. With a shaking hand, she reached for the handle and pulled it open. Inside, neatly arranged before takeoff, had been a series of emergency supplies: fire extinguishers, oxygen masks, first aid kits, and a maintenance toolbox. One of those items was missing. Her eyes darted across the remaining contents. The fire extinguisher? Still there. The oxygen masks? Untouched. The first aid kits? Neatly stacked. But the maintenance toolbox, a small heavy-duty case containing essential tools for minor in-flight repairs, was gone. Elise's pulse roared in her ears. Why would anyone take a toolbox? What could they possibly need it for mid-flight? She turned back to the aisle, her heart hammering, and that's when she saw her. A woman, mid-30s, sharp blue eyes filled with fear. She was sitting in seat 22A, clutching the armrests as if she were holding on to reality itself. But it wasn't her tension that made Elise's breath catch. It was the way she looked past Elise toward the open compartment, and then back at her with a silent plea. She knew something. Elise started toward her, ready to ask questions, to demand answers, but before she could speak, the woman shook her head violently. Her lips parted and she mouthed a single word. Don't. At that precise moment, a loud thump echoed from the rear of the plane. Elise's blood ran cold. The passengers remained unaware, lost in their slumber, but she knew that sound. It hadn't come from turbulence. It hadn't come from shifting luggage. It had come from inside the plane. Something, or someone, was moving where they shouldn't be. And they weren't alone. Elise took a slow, measured breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Whatever was happening on this flight, it was unfolding fast, and she needed to act before it spiraled out of control. She scanned the dimly lit cabin, her fingers tightening around the edge of the service cart as she tried to assess her next move. The missing passenger. The stolen toolbox. The terrified woman in 22A. Every thread was weaving into a larger, more ominous pattern, one she had yet to fully understand. Elise knew she had no choice. She had to find out who was lurking in the shadows of the plane, and stop them before it was too late. Elise's hands trembled as she clutched the napkin with the cryptic message. The atmosphere inside the plane had shifted from routine to something much darker, and she could no longer ignore the growing sense of dread. Whoever had left that note was terrified. And now, the missing toolbox and the noise from the rear of the plane only solidified one thing. This was no coincidence. She had to act. No. Elise inhaled deeply and forced herself to walk calmly down the aisle, her pulse thudding against her ribcage. She made her way back toward the galley, glancing at the passengers as she passed. Most remained oblivious to the storm brewing around them, but a few seemed unusually tense, like the woman in 22A, whose warning still echoed in Elise's mind. She paused beside the rear lavatories, pretending to check the seatbelt signs. A soft metallic sound caught her ear, like tools shifting inside a container. Her breath hitched. The noise was coming from behind the locked service door, the one leading to the aircraft's underbelly storage compartments. It was never accessed mid-flight. Her fingers hovered over the intercom button. She should alert the pilot, inform the crew, do something, but before she could, the door rattled again. And this time there was no mistaking it. Someone was inside. Elise turned just as a shadow moved at the end of the aisle. Her blood ran cold. 14B, he was back. The man in the hoodie stood just beyond the curtain separating economy from business class. His eyes weren't on the exit this time. They were on her. Then, without breaking eye contact, he smiled. Elise's breath caught. It wasn't a warm, reassuring smile. It was something else. A warning. Then he turned and walked straight toward the cockpit. Elise's heart nearly stopped. What was he about to do? She had no choice. She sprinted toward the intercom, her fingers fumbling as she pressed the button. The pilot's voice crackled to life just as the cabin lights flickered, a brief, eerie pulse that sent a wave of gasps through the passengers. The plane lurched. The fastened seatbelt signs blinked erratically. The passengers stirred, confused murmurs filling the air. Elise barely had time to process what was happening before the aircraft dipped sharply to one side. Screams erupted. A child wailed. Luggage compartments creaked under the strain. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the turbulence stopped. The plane steadied. But Elise knew. This wasn't turbulence. This wasn't mechanical failure. Someone had done this on purpose. She turned to the cockpit door, and saw him standing in front of it, one hand raised, holding something. A keycard. Elise's stomach dropped. He was about to open the cockpit. Her voice caught in her throat, but she forced herself to scream. Stop him. Elise's voice rang through the cabin, sharp and urgent. Heads snapped toward her, passengers jolting awake from their uneasy slumber. But it was already too late. The man in the hoodie had swiped the keycard against the cockpit access panel. The light flashed green. Elise lunged forward, shoving past the startled businessman in the aisle, but the door was already swinging open. The hooded man slipped inside, vanishing behind the reinforced barrier. The cockpit door slammed shut before she could reach it. Her stomach twisted. This was bad. Captain, she screamed into the intercom. Someone just entered the cockpit. Unauthorized entry. A loud pop crackled over the speakers, followed by static. Then silence. The connection was dead. Elise's breath came in short, panicked bursts. The plane was still level, still flying, but for how long? She turned wildly, searching for help. 22A, the woman who had tried to warn her, was already unbuckling her seatbelt. Their eyes met, and Elise saw the terror written across the woman's face. "He has a weapon," the woman mouthed. Elise felt ice spread through her veins. A weapon? On a plane? She pivoted toward the nearest crew intercom, hitting the emergency override. Nothing. The system had been disabled. The pilots were cut off from the rest of the aircraft. The hijacker had planned this. Shouts erupted from the passengers as confusion spread. A few had seen what happened, others were frantically looking around, trying to understand why their flight attendant had screamed. A man in 7C, a former military officer judging by his build, stood up. "What's going on?" he demanded. Elise took a sharp breath. "We have an intruder in the cockpit." "We?" A sharp descent interrupted her words. The plane tilted forward, sending a wave of gasps and shrieks through the cabin. People clutched their armrests, some grabbing at overhead bins as the nose of the aircraft dipped. Elise's feet slid, but she caught herself against a seat. The plane shuddered violently before stabilizing again. The hijacker was controlling the aircraft. She turned back to 7C, her voice urgent. "We need to take that cockpit back. Now." The man nodded, his expression grim. "How?" Elise thought fast. They couldn't brute force their way in. The cockpit door was reinforced to withstand attacks. But there were other ways. She glanced toward the galley. The hijacker had taken a toolbox earlier. If he had used a stolen keycard, that meant he'd also needed tools to tamper with the system. And if he had tampered with the electrics? Her eyes locked onto the circuit breaker panel at the back of the plane. Hope flared. If she could reset the cockpit's access controls, the hijacker might be forced to open the door, or lose control of the plane entirely. Elise turned to 7C and 22A, who had now made her way toward them. "I have an idea, but I need cover. Keep the passengers calm. Don't let anyone panic." 22A gave a tense nod. "I'll help." Elise pushed toward the rear of the plane, keeping a steady, authoritative pace. The last thing she needed was a stampede of frightened passengers. As she reached the panel, her fingers hovered over the controls. One wrong switch and she could plunge the entire cabin into darkness. But if she could just cut power to the cockpit. She found the override switch for the cockpit door security system. Asterisk, her heart pounded. Asterisk, this was it. A deep breath. A silent prayer. She flipped the switch. For half a second, nothing happened. Then, the lights flickered, dimming for a brief moment before stabilizing. The cabin speakers screeched with a burst of static. And then, asterisk, the cockpit asterisk door clicked open. Gasps rippled through the plane. Elise's stomach twisted as she watched the door inch open just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond it. Then, a hand reached out. But it wasn't the pilot's. It was the hijacker's. Asterisk, and he was holding. Elise's breath caught in her throat as the hijacker's hand emerged from the cockpit, the unmistakable gleam of a gun clutched in his fingers. A ripple of panic swept through the cabin, passengers gasping in horror. Her mind raced. If he fired, the bullet could pierce the thin cabin walls or hit an innocent passenger. This was a situation that required precision, courage, and sheer, unwavering determination. 7C moved first. His military training kicked in as he lunged toward the hijacker, reaching for the gun. But the hijacker was fast. He swung the weapon upward, aiming directly at Elise. She threw herself sideways, feeling the rush of air as the gun discharged. The deafening blast sent passengers into screams, but miraculously, the bullet had only embedded itself into the overhead paneling. Elise knew they had seconds before chaos erupted. Thinking quickly, she grabbed the metal coffee pot from the service cart nearby and without hesitation, swung it with all her strength. The pot smashed into the hijacker's arm, sending the gun skittering across the floor toward the rows of frightened passengers. The man stumbled back with a snarl of pain, his hood falling away to reveal a hardened, scarred face. Before he could react, 7C tackled him to the ground, wrestling him into submission. Elise turned to the passengers. "Get the gun," she screamed. A woman in 14B was the first to react, snatching up the weapon and holding it tight to her chest. Elise didn't hesitate. She leapt over the struggling men and burst into the cockpit. The sight inside sent a cold shock through her body. Both pilots were unconscious, their hands still gripping the controls. The autopilot indicator was flashing, overridden by manual input. The hijacker had disabled communication systems and changed the flight path. They were descending. Fast. Elise grabbed the radio, desperately flicking through channels. "Mayday, mayday. This is Flight 287. We have a hijacker subdued, but the pilots are unconscious. Requesting immediate assistance." Static. Her fingers flew to the altitude controls. She had no formal flight training, but she had listened to the pilots enough to understand the basics. The plane was plummeting far too quickly. If she didn't act now, they would crash. 7C stumbled into the cockpit, breathing hard. "The hijacker's down," he said. "How bad is it?" "We're in a rapid descent," Elise said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need help stabilizing this." He moved beside her, scanning the panels. "I flew cargo planes in the military, but this is a whole different beast." Elise didn't care. "Can you help me level us out?" He nodded, taking the co-pilot's seat. Together they worked through muscle memory and pure adrenaline, gripping the yoke and pulling back with everything they had. The plane shuddered violently as they fought against gravity, their bodies straining against the sheer force of the descent. At last, after what felt like an eternity, the nose of the plane began to lift. The altitude meter stabilized. The roar of the engines settled. The plane was still in the air. A shaky breath escaped Elise's lips. "We did it." But the crisis wasn't over yet. She flipped through radio frequencies again, desperately trying to connect to air traffic control. Finally, a crackling voice responded. "Flight 287, this is Tower Control. We've lost communication with your pilots. Identify yourself." "This is Flight Attendant Elise Carter. We were hijacked. The pilots are unconscious, but we have control of the plane. We need an emergency landing, now." There was a pause before the voice responded. "Understood, Elise. Stay calm. We're guiding you in." The next 10 minutes felt like hours. With the coaching of air traffic control, Elise and 7C worked together, hands trembling but determined. Every decision mattered. Every second counted. Finally, the runway came into view. The sight of the flashing landing lights sent a wave of relief through Elise's chest. They were almost home. The cabin was eerily silent as passengers braced for impact. Elise's grip tightened on the controls. "Hold on," she whispered. The wheels screeched against the tarmac, the force jolting them all forward. The plane trembled, bouncing once, then twice before finally settling. They had landed. Alive. A collective cry of relief filled the cabin. Tears, laughter, disbelief, it all erupted at once. Elise's hands trembled as she unbuckled herself, exhaustion washing over her. But it wasn't over yet. The authorities swarmed the aircraft the moment they came to a stop. The hijacker, still restrained, was dragged away, his fight over. Paramedics rushed to the cockpit, attending to the unconscious pilots. The passengers, still shaken, cheered for Elise and 7C. As Elise stepped into the aisle, a woman reached for her hand. 22A. "You saved us," she whispered, eyes filled with gratitude. "You didn't have to, but you did." Elise swallowed the lump in her throat. "It was my job." But deep down she knew it was more than that. It was who she was. As the authorities led her away for questioning, she cast one last glance at the plane, the place where everything had changed. And she knew without a doubt, this flight would never leave her. If you were in Elise's shoes, what would you have done? This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a moment that demanded courage, resilience, and the will to fight back against the impossible. What would you do in the face of danger? Subscribe for more gripping stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Because the next mystery? It might be even closer than you think.